How well aware the court is that we have a very serious task here. We've been here for 4 days, and at this point we have to look critically at what we've heard and what we've seen over the last 4 days and determine if there's enough evidence by a probable cause standard that Mr. Butts committed premeditated first-degree murder. And if you look critically at what the evidence is and the lack of connection between these pieces of alleged evidence, there is not even by a probable cause standard. To bind over on premeditated first-degree murder, there has to be sufficient facts or evidence to show by a probable cause standard that each of the elements of premeditated murder in the first degree were committed. First, there's got to be a death. There has to be evidence that the defendant caused the death of the deceased, that some action that he made or did cause that person's death, that there was an intent to kill, that the intent to kill was premeditated, and that it was deliberate. And here there is not enough evidence, even by a probable cause standard, that Jarvis Butts caused the death of NaZiyah Harris. There's been no testimony of any eyewitness stating that they saw Jarvis Butts doing any act that could have caused NaZiyah Harris's death. There's been no testimony of any eyewitness that they saw Jarvis Butts doing anything in preparation of doing something that could have caused her death. And there's been no admission of Mr. Butts to support that element. There's not probable cause to believe that Mr. Butts had an intent to kill NaZiyah Harris, nor that he premeditated her death. There's no evidence of any threats made by Mr. Butts to NaZiyah. There's no evidence of any threats made to a third party that he was going to do something or that he had a problem that he had to take care of. The issue or the statement was he had a legal matter, and Ms. Davis testified that she was aware of an issue that he had in Clinton Township and that she was the one that was driving him around to court. There's no testimony that he took any specific action in a deliberation to kill her, or that in killing her. There's Google searches about legal ways to abort a child, not how to kill somebody or dispose of a body. There's no evidence that he did anything related to the Google searches. There's no receipts of purchases or anything like that. And these text messages were 2 weeks after. They were, I believe, December 9th and 10th, which was, I believe, 2 weeks or 13 days from 11/27/23, which is the text message about gym class. And then there's this kind of cryptic text message in between that says, "It healed." We don't know what that means, but we don't know what Mr. Butts took that to mean. It doesn't necessarily mean that he believed she was pregnant. There's no evidence of a pregnancy. We have medical records until, I believe it's October of 2023, that don't indicate a pregnancy, that she had been to the doctor in September when she originally texts or messages Mr. Butts and says she thinks that she's pregnant. There's no evidence of a pregnancy. She went to the doctor. We heard from both her guardian, her grandmother, and her aunt, Shannon Harris, who lived with her. No testimony from either of them that they suspected that she was pregnant, that there was any medical issues that they had to take care of because that would have caused them to think that she was pregnant. There was an insinuation, well, was she wearing baggy clothing? Was she wearing bigger clothing? There was no testimony that they had to go out and buy new clothes for her because her clothes didn't fit, or that she started wearing baggy clothing. She was wearing denim pants on the day that she disappeared, and there's no testimony that those were not pants that they had recently bought because she didn't fit into the clothing that she previously had. There's no evidence of any kind of plan. There's no messaging between Mr. Butts and Ms. Harris that indicates an escalation of animosity between the two of them. In fact, he essentially kind of starts to disengage. And so there's no written evidence that he had any kind of plan or any animosity toward her at that point. Our submission would be that he understood at that point that she wasn't pregnant and was disengaging. Let's talk about what we did see. So we know that NaZiyah got on her school bus around 2:45 on the 9th. She got off the bus a few minutes later. and then she was seen walking up Bedford. She was wearing at that point light color blue jeans, a black hoodie, and then a colorful coat with fur around the hood. There's some insinuation that somehow there was a plan that she would meet up with Mr. Butts, but the testimony of Mr. Wright was that they were driving around that afternoon back and forth to various auto parts stores, and I believe that they in fact had to go back to one kind of unplanned because they either missed something or there was an issue. And so to say that somehow Mr. Butts would have known that she would have been on that street at that specific time and that they would have been there at that specific time is quite a leap, considering they didn't know where they were going to be when, because they were doing all this driving around back and forth to various stores. Witnesses put NaZiyah at Mr. Butts' auto shop later that afternoon, and then in Ypsilanti with Mr. Butts and Cordell Wright, and Mr. Wright puts her back at the shop later that evening. But then we hear from Sergeant O'Rourke, who did all the cell phone mapping, that at 9 p.m., Mr. Butts was actually at 13662 Wilshire, which is his home, where Angel Leonard lives and where they have kids. So did NaZiyah go back with him to that house? And then at 9:30 is when he checks in to the Park Crest Motel. Now, we don't know who was with him there, but there is no evidence that NaZiyah was ever there. They searched it, they took DNA, they took clippings of various things, they swabbed the shower drain, and there's no evidence that she was ever in that room. We did hear testimony that the Park Crest is a known place where Mr. Butts frequents and takes various lady friends for a rendezvous. It's much more possible and plausible that he took somebody, one of his lady friends there, than somebody who he was going to kill, right? He's going to a place where they know him. He's a frequent flyer there. And is he going to take somebody there where he would later, before he was going to kill them? That makes no sense. That is not logical. We heard then that after Mr. Butts left the Park Crest Motel, he went to 4 Alexandrine, which is Midtown, so kind of across town, and that's where his other girlfriend, Najeen Rushing, lives. So did he take NaZiyah with him there to see Miss Rushing? And he stays there for a while, I think, according to Sergeant O'Rourke's mapping. And then we hear that he is at 7 Mile and Berg on January the 10th at 11:40 p.m. for over an hour. That's almost 24 hours from when he initially, it's beyond 24 hours from when he initially is with NaZiyah, or when he's last with NaZiyah. And so it's illogical to think that he was driving around with NaZiyah, visiting all of his girlfriends, or if he had done something to her previously, that she was in the car with him while he did that. And in fact, they took a cadaver dog around the car and didn't find anything. And they tested the vehicles, all of his vehicles, every car that he drove, for DNA, for any sign that NaZiyah had been in there, and they found nothing. And the call to Miss Johnson asking her to wipe down the Sentra that she used, that he had borrowed, is kind of irrelevant because she testified that she didn't do it. That she did nothing based on what he called to say, and they still didn't, nothing was found. We heard about a pink jumpsuit that was found. We didn't hear any testimony that anybody saw NaZiyah wearing this pink jumpsuit. She's not seen wearing it in any video. I don't believe that anybody even identified it as being hers. I don't believe there was any testimony from either Annette Harris or Shannon Harris stating, yes, we recognize that pink jumpsuit, that's something that NaZiyah wears. When did she have it? There was one blood stain on that jumpsuit. And the testimony from the forensic analyst, Rion Green, was that it was such a small stain that she was afraid she would consume it if she did additional testing. She tested it once and couldn't do any follow-up testing or confirmatory testing because she was afraid they were going to consume the sample. There was also no statistically significant support for finding Mr. Butt's DNA on that stain sample from the pink jumpsuit. And there was no statistically significant probability that his DNA was on the jumpsuit at all, that he had had any contact with the jumpsuit. And they took a lot of swabs of that jumpsuit. I believe the number was that forensic analyst Anderson testified to, that it was 24 trillion times more likely to have originated from two unrelated unknown contributors than Jarvis Butts. Then we heard about the black hoodie. And that black hoodie was significantly more weathered than the pink jumpsuit. We heard about that from the Border Patrol agent Barnes and other folks that came into contact with that sweatshirt, that it looked like it had been out in the weather much longer. And we don't have an explanation for that, but those appear to be tears in the top of the hood. They don't appear to be stab wounds, and they certainly don't appear to be bullet holes. There's weak support for conclusion that Mr. Butts was a contributor to the stain in the swabs of the black hoodie. The only real support for any DNA on the black hoodie was on the non-stained part. And there's testimony that Ms. Harris was wearing that hoodie on the 9th, that she was in Mr. Butts' Escalade when he and Mr. Wright picked her up after seeing her walking down Harper, that they were in the car driving up to Ypsilanti. And so the possibility that his DNA got on this non-stained part of the black hoodie is not evidence of premeditated murder in the context of all of the ways that we heard somebody's DNA can get on a piece of clothing. And I kind of talked about this, but we heard testimony that Mr. Butts drove both a Cadillac Escalade and a Nissan Sentra on January 9th and January 10th. There's a lot of pieces of those cars that were tested. Trunk carpet from various areas in both cars, the driver's floor mat, the driver's seat, the door handle, trunk speakers, the trunk frame. All of those things were swabbed for blood, and nothing was found. We heard about a school ID card that belonged to NaZiyah. We heard Valerie Smith testify that she noticed it at some point in February, maybe a month or so after NaZiyah was last seen, and that she decided to pick it up 2.5 weeks after she first spotted it. But she was pretty clear that she only noticed it about 2 weeks before, but that she looked at it every single day. Seemingly, if it had been there before then, she would have noticed it. When did it get there? We don't know. There was no evidence. There's no testimony as to that. And there was no other evidence found in the 7 Mile and Greenfield area, and there's no evidence that Mr. Butts was there. We talked a little bit about the medical records, but all they tell us is that NaZiyah Harris didn't have a life-threatening condition as of October 24th. They don't tell us anything about her physical condition between the 24th and the 9th, and they don't tell us that she was pregnant. They're just not relevant, except for the fact, I guess, that they don't tell us that she was pregnant, and she was there on September the 27th, according to her text messages. What we haven't heard in the last 3 to 4 days is anything about a murder weapon. We've heard that they collected guns, but we don't know if any of them actually operated, and they tested them for DNA, and there was nothing found. When did those guns get taken from a house? When did they get put back, if any of them had been used? And I mean, we just simply don't have any evidence as to whether they were even touched by Mr. Butts. But certainly there was no DNA from Ms. Harris on them. And if one was to use a gun to bludgeon somebody enough where they break the skin and bleed, there's going to be DNA on that gun. If somebody is shot at close range by a gun, there's likely to be DNA on that gun. They found no DNA on a gun. There was initially a testimony about all these knives that were found, and then when Mr. Riggins did a little bit of digging, well, one of them was a butter knife, one of them was rusted and under a seat and looked like it had been there forever. There was only one knife that they were actually interested in. They sent it for testing, and there was nothing on it. And we know that they can test for blood even if something has been wiped clean, because they do that, and in fact they did that in this case. And they found no blood on anything that the prosecution is positing could have been a murder weapon. Motive is not an element of premeditated homicide. There's evidence that Mr. Butts and NaZiyah had a sexual relationship. And we are, at this point, not contesting the bind over on those counts. that would explain why Mr. Butts would not want to be honest about why he was with NaZiyah Harris. That would be enough to make somebody want to lie about their whereabouts or their connection to somebody. There's no evidence that it went any further than that for him. No evidence that he had been confronted by anybody about a sexual assault. No evidence that he was being threatened by NaZiyah to expose him or get him in trouble if he didn't do something that she wanted him to do. By the time January 9th rolled around, they weren't really speaking that much. She was, in those text messages that we heard, getting frustrated with him for ignoring her. But never once did she say, well, if you don't talk to me, I'm going to tell everybody what we've been doing. And so there's a complete lack of any motive for him to respond in that way. And I would point the court to a case, it's called People v. Fisher, and it's 193 Mishap 284. It's a 1992 case, and I've got copies.
What was the last one?
Got it. Does the court want?
Yeah.
And I point the court to this case because it's a case where homicide was charged and no body was found. A woman named Joyce Fisher was killed, and I believe it was 8 years after her death, her husband was charged. He was convicted, and ultimately the appellate court reversed the conviction because the evidence was insufficient to submit the case to a jury, and so that was the error. And kind of the facts briefly are that Mr. and Mrs. Fisher were in the process of divorcing. It was a pretty contentious relationship. There had been lots of reports that he had been physically abusive to her, and she had even testified that he had threatened to kill her in mid-January of 1978, approximately 3 months before she disappeared. In April of 1978, apparently they were out together, they had lunch, and he was the last person to see her. After that, she disappeared. Now, there was no substantial testimony in that trial regarding her reliability, her long or short-term plans, that she had children, that she was devoted to them, and that she wouldn't have had any reason to run away or leave. And so that gave rise to an inference that she was deceased. The prosecutor in that case offered no evidence of an act that resulted in Joyce Fisher's death. And the court previously has held that the victim's body, while it's not necessary to establish corpus delicti, there has to be something more. There has to be, in this case, either an admission or confession, physical evidence, or some kind of witness testimony. In that case, there was no physical evidence, such as bloodstains or a weapon, linking the defendant to Joyce's death. He did not admit that he killed her, although the prosecutor offered equivocal statements there, that he seemed to say, well, things didn't happen quite that way, and where it made it sound like maybe he did have something or some knowledge. The prosecutor there presented lots of evidence of defendant's motive and opportunity to kill her, but noted that those are not elements of the crime. And inferences, the court says, may not be based on evidence that is uncertain or speculative or merely raises a conjecture or a possibility. And they said in that case, the evidence did not rise above the level of conjecture. And that's what we have here. We have conjecture. We have a lot of pieces of supposed evidence, but we have no connection. They don't connect to each other. They're puzzle pieces. And when you put them together, there's no picture. There is no big picture because there is no act that can be testified to that Mr. Butts did, and there's nothing to support that act. There's no evidence that he had a gun and used it. There's no evidence that he had a knife and used it. In fact, the evidence that the prosecutor put forward disputes those theories. The idea that Mr. Butts was in some cover-up, the issue of his phone, I think was pretty well cleared up by Ms. Davis when she testified to the idea that for as long as she's known him, he's never wanted her to look at his phone. And mostly because he's been dealing with who knows how many other women. And that she had tried pretty much everything she could think of to get in that phone well before any of these allegations came about and that she's never been able to. And so it makes sense that he would not want her to get in that phone, especially if he assumed he was coming home and wanted to have contact with her while he was serving his sentence in the Wayne County Jail, that she not know that she was not the only female he was dealing with. We acknowledge that probable cause is a low standard, but it isn't just limited to whether the prosecution has presented significant or sufficient evidence on each element of the offense, which we submit they have not. They also must determine that there's a reasonable ground of suspicion supported by circumstances sufficiently strong to warrant a cautious person to believe the accused is guilty. That definition of probable cause, or that characterization, comes from People v. Carter, which is 250 Mishap 510. And so you have to have both elements of the crime met, and also those elements have to be met by evidence that is sufficiently strong to believe that it is relevant, that it actually proves what it is saying that it proves. And here we have conjecture, we have speculation, we have supposition, and we have somebody who he did have something to hide. But there's no evidence that he did anything about that. He didn't threaten her, he didn't ask her, or say if anybody finds out that, I will go to jail, or you could go to jail, or you could be hurt. There was nothing like that in any of those conversations that we saw. So, Your Honor, even by the relatively low standard of probable cause, we'd submit that there is insufficient evidence of both the idea that Mr. Butts did something to cause the death of NaZiyah Harris, and that he intended to kill her, or that intent to kill was premeditated. We don't know what happened when she left his shop on January